the desert always looked endless from the highway. For miles, Daniel Carter had driven through a shimmering blur of sand and heat, the road twisting like a snake across the barren landscape. In the back seat, his two children, Lily and Ben, dozed fitfully, their heads bouncing with every bump. His wife Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, sunglasses shielding her tired eyes as she stared at the dunes. After hours of driving, a faded wooden sign appeared on the roadside. "Welcome to Sunspire, a community of order and peace." The letters were chipped and sun-bleached, but the name sent a strange chill through Emma. It was as though the desert had swallowed the town whole and left behind a relic. As they drove in, the landscape shifted. Rows of adobe-style houses lined the streets, each painted in identical shades of beige and rust. Not one roof tile was out of place, not one wall showed cracks despite the brutal desert sun. And everywhere, cacti stood like guards, tall and still, each one facing east in perfect unison. "Creepy," Emma muttered under her breath. "It's like everything was arranged on purpose." Daniel smirked. "That's what HOAs do, Em. They love order." But even he couldn't deny the eeriness. There were no children playing, no dogs barking, no sound of life except the hum of the engine. Windows were shuttered, curtains drawn, as if the residents were watching without being seen. The Carters pulled into the driveway of their new home. The house looked nearly identical to the rest, its beige walls spotless, the red clay roof gleaming as though freshly washed. As Emma stepped out, the dry wind stung her skin, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and something metallic, almost like rusted iron. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, their first visitor arrived. A sharp knock echoed on the door. Emma answered, finding a frail old woman standing there. Her silver hair was braided tightly, her eyes sharp despite her age. She clutched a thick binder marked Sunspire HOA Regulations. "Mrs. Carter?" the woman asked. "I'm Mrs. Delaney. Welcome to Sunspire. I'm on the HOA Compliance Board." Her voice was polite, but her gaze seemed to measure Emma carefully, as if weighing her worth. She handed over the binder. Emma forced a smile. "Thank you. We'll look this over." "Be sure you do," Mrs. Delaney replied. "The rules are not optional here." Before Emma could respond, the woman leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Remember this above all, repaint your home before the full moon rises. And make certain your cactus faces east." "Never," she paused, glancing over her shoulder at the darkening street. "Never ask why." Emma blinked, unsettled. But when she looked again, Mrs. Delaney was already walking briskly away, her figure vanishing into the twilight. That night, the desert seemed alive. The wind stilled, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against the windows. Emma tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, she rose and looked out. The moon had climbed high, silvering the desert. And then, she saw them. Shadows moved across the ridge beyond the houses. Tall, thin, and oddly bent, like figures stretched too long. They walked in silence, their heads all turned east, facing the horizon. Emma gasped and rubbed her eyes. But when she looked again, the ridge was empty. Only the still cacti stood watch. She told herself it was exhaustion, a trick of the desert night. Yet deep down, a knot of unease tightened in her chest. Sunspire wasn't just another HOA-controlled community. Something was wrong here. Something older than bylaws and paint codes. And as the moonlight bathed the silent town, Emma whispered to herself, "What did we just move into?" The next morning, Emma was woken by the sound of scratching. For a moment, she thought it was inside the house, something crawling against the walls. But when she opened the curtains, she saw it was just the branches of a cactus brushing lightly in the desert breeze. The odd part was, she could have sworn that cactus hadn't been there yesterday. She shook it off, made coffee, and tried to pretend the first night had just been nerves. Yet as the family adjusted to life in Sunspire, unease threaded itself into every corner. Neighbors introduced themselves politely but with a strange distance, as if rehearsed. The Carters met the Walkers next door, a middle-aged couple with plastered smiles who immediately reminded Emma to review the rules. When Daniel tried to joke about the full moon painting deadline, Mr. Walker's face stiffened. "We don't joke about compliance," he said flatly. Then, after a pause that lingered too long, he added, "It's for everyone's safety." Emma laughed nervously. Safety? From what? Later that afternoon, as Emma walked the kids to the corner store, she noticed how every front yard was immaculate. Not a pebble out of place, not a blade of grass untrimmed. The uniformity was unsettling, almost militaristic. And everywhere, cacti faced east, their spines glowing faintly in the sun. At the store, she overheard two residents whispering near the shelves of canned goods. "Did you see the Carter's cactus?" one hissed. "It's not aligned." "They'll fix it," the other replied quickly. "They'd better. We all remember what happened to the Sanchez family." Emma froze. But when she turned to confront them, both smiled brightly, pretending nothing had been said. That evening, the Carters were summoned to their first community meeting. The HOA had taken over the town hall, a squat building near the center of Sunspire. Inside, folding chairs were neatly aligned in rows. At the front, a man in a crisp red tie stood behind a podium. "Welcome," he began, his voice smooth but cold. "I am Mr. Alden, president of the Sunspire HOA. We are pleased to have the Carters join us." Behind him stood 3 HOA officers in black uniforms, their faces expressionless, hands clasped behind their backs. They didn't look like volunteers or security guards. They looked like soldiers. Mr. Alden continued. "Our community thrives on discipline. The desert demands it. You will follow all regulations. The full moon is in 3 nights. Compliance is expected." Daniel raised a hand. "And if we don't?" The room fell silent. Every neighbor turned to stare, their expressions strangely blank. Mr. Alden smiled thinly. "Non-compliance is unacceptable." Emma squeezed Daniel's arm, trying to keep him quiet. But he muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." After the meeting, as they left the hall, Emma noticed the HOA officers didn't walk like normal men. Their movements were too smooth, too deliberate, as if every step was rehearsed. And when one officer turned his head, his eyes seemed to flash, not with light, but with something hollow. That night, as the Carters ate dinner, a low hum drifted through the air. At first, Emma thought it was an engine. But when she stepped outside, she realized it was voices. Dozens of them. Across the neighborhood, people were standing silently in their yards, all facing east. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words Emma couldn't understand. Her skin crawled. She called Daniel to the window. He scoffed. "Probably some ritual. These people are nuts." But Emma wasn't so sure. Because as she watched, she swore she saw one of the cacti shift, just slightly, turning on its own toward the east, as if obeying the whispers. The hum stopped suddenly, and everyone walked back inside as though nothing had happened. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Sunspire wasn't simply about strict neighbors and quirky rules. There was something larger, darker, pulling the strings. And the HOA wasn't enforcing order just for appearances. They were guarding something. When she tucked her children into bed that night, Lily whispered, "Mom, the cactus outside my window moved." Emma's heart froze. The full moon rose like a silver coin above the desert, spilling its cold light across the silent streets of Sunspire. Inside the Carter home, the family tried to sleep, but unease pressed against the walls as if the desert itself were leaning closer. Daniel had insisted on ignoring the HOA's bizarre demands. "We're not painting a whole house in 3 days," he had said firmly. "And that cactus isn't hurting anyone. They can fine us if they want, but I'm not wasting my time." Emma had argued, begged even, but Daniel wouldn't bend. He was tired of being pushed around by rules that made no sense. But as midnight drew near, Emma couldn't shake Mrs. Delaney's warning, "Never ask why." At exactly 12, a sharp, unnatural knock rattled the front door. 3 times. Slow. Heavy. Emma sat up in bed, heart pounding. Daniel muttered angrily, pulled on a shirt, and stomped down the hallway. Emma followed, dread prickling her skin. When he flung open the door, 3 HOA officers in black uniforms stood on the porch. Their posture was stiff, their expressions blank, eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made them look hollow. Behind them, the desert wind had stilled completely. Not a grain of sand moved. The officer in the center spoke, his voice deep and flat. "Noncompliance will not be tolerated. Step outside." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "We're not criminals. You don't get to order me around." Emma gripped his arm. "Daniel, please." But her words died as she noticed something horrifying. The officer's boots didn't sink into the sand. They left no footprints at all. The officer repeated, louder this time. "Step outside." Daniel refused. "No. This is harassment." He tried to slam the door, but one gloved hand shot forward, catching it with unnatural strength. The wood groaned under his grip. Behind the officers, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, moving silently into the streets. Men, women, children, every one of them barefoot, their faces blank, their eyes glowing faintly under the moon. They stood in rows, all facing east, their mouths beginning to move in unison. A low chant rose, eerie and guttural, words that didn't belong to any language Emma knew. The sound crawled under her skin. The officer leaned forward, his face inches from Daniel's. His skin flickered, like heat rising from asphalt, and for a moment Emma saw what lay beneath, something cracked and dry, like stone split by centuries of desert sun. A hollow thing wearing human skin. Emma screamed and slammed her shoulder into the door. Daniel shoved with all his strength, forcing it shut. The officers didn't pound or shout, they simply stood there, silent, as the chanting outside grew louder. Then the house began to tremble. The walls groaned as if pressed from the outside. The windows rattled violently. From the children's room upstairs came a shriek, Lily and Ben yelling for their parents. Emma bolted up the stairs, clutching them as they cried. Through the window, she saw the impossible. The cacti across the neighborhood were turning on their own, twisting slowly eastward, their spines glowing faintly in the moonlight. Downstairs, Daniel held the door shut with his shoulder, sweat dripping down his face. "They're not human, Em," he shouted. "They're not." A loud crack split the air. The front door frame splintered. The officers didn't force their way in like men would. Instead, they simply leaned forward, and the wood bent as though it were sand beneath their weight. The chanting outside rose into a frenzy. The neighbors' voices became one, echoing like thunder. "Paint before the moon. Align the east. Paint before the moon. Align the east." Emma clutched the children, her heart racing. She wanted to run, to flee into the desert, but when she looked out the window she saw only shifting dunes where the road had been. They were trapped. The door buckled. Daniel stumbled back, bracing himself with a kitchen chair. The officers stood in the doorway, still as statues. They didn't need to move, the desert itself seemed to move with them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The chanting silenced. The neighbors lowered their heads and shuffled back inside their homes. The officers released the door, stepping backward into the moonlight. Without a word, they turned and walked away, their figures dissolving into the desert haze. The Carters stood in stunned silence. The house was still, though cracks now marred the walls. The children sobbed quietly, clinging to Emma. Daniel whispered, his voice trembling despite his defiance. "What the hell is this place?" Emma had no answer. But she knew one thing, the HOA wasn't enforcing rules out of obsession. They were guarding something. And the desert wanted blood. The Carter home was still trembling when dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert gold. Emma hadn't slept. She sat on the couch with Lily and Ben curled against her, while Daniel paced the living room like a caged animal. The cracks in the walls looked worse in the daylight, proof that the night's horrors had been real. Daniel finally broke the silence. We're leaving. Today. I don't care if I have to drive through the desert with no map. We're not staying here another night. Emma wanted to agree, but she remembered the way the road had vanished, swallowed by shifting dunes. They couldn't just drive out. Something held them here. Before she could respond, a soft knock tapped against the back door. Not the heavy, unnatural pounding of the officers, but a hurried, almost frightened rhythm. Daniel tensed, grabbing a wrench from the toolbox. Emma peeked through the blinds and saw Mrs. Delaney, the old neighbor, standing outside in a faded shawl. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around as if she feared being followed. "Let her in," Emma whispered. Daniel hesitated, then unlocked the door. Mrs. Delaney slipped inside quickly, closing it behind her with trembling hands. "You survived the night," she said breathlessly. "Most don't." Emma's heart pounded. "Please, tell us what's happening. Who are those officers? What do they want?" Mrs. Delaney's eyes filled with sorrow. "It isn't about what they want. It's about what the desert demands." She sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Sunspire was built on cursed ground. Long before the HOA, before the town, before any settlers came, this desert belonged to something older. The tribes who once lived here called it the sleeper beneath the sand. They warned that no home should ever face the dunes, no cactus should turn away from the sunrise. The alignment matters, it keeps the sleeper dreaming. Daniel scoffed. "That's ridiculous. You're telling me a monster under the sand cares which way a cactus points." Mrs. Delaney's gaze snapped to him, sharp and urgent. "You saw the officers. Do you think they're human? Do you think this town follows ordinary rules? The HOA wasn't formed to enforce paint and plants, it was formed to contain the sleeper. Every rule, every demand, every midnight patrol, it's all to keep it asleep." Emma shivered. "And if we break the rules?" Mrs. Delaney lowered her voice to a whisper. "The sleeper stirs. It calls through the sand. It uses the officers, the neighbors, the very desert itself to punish those who disobey. The chanting, the shifting roads, you've already seen the signs. If it wakes fully," she trailed off, her lips trembling. "The town will vanish beneath the desert, just like the one that stood here before." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "There was another town?" Mrs. Delaney nodded. "Buried. Every soul lost. They said the dunes swallowed it in a single night. Sunspire was built over its bones, under the promise that the rules would be followed without question." Daniel slammed the wrench against the table. "So everyone here just goes along with this madness? Paint your house or get eaten by some desert ghost? That's insane." Mrs. Delaney's voice cracked. "Do you think I like living this way? Do you think I wanted my husband to march into the street one night, chanting with the others, his eyes blank? He never came home. They took him. The HOA doesn't protect us. It enslaves us." Emma's hands tightened around her children. She could see the truth in the old woman's eyes, the weight of years spent surviving in silence. "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Delaney leaned closer, her whisper fierce. "You obey until you find a way out. But you mustn't let the officers mark your home again. Once the sleeper sets its eye on you, there's no escaping its hunger." A sound interrupted them, the faint scrape of sand against glass. Emma turned her head slowly toward the window. Outside, a tall cactus that had stood straight for years was slowly, impossibly, twisting its body eastward, its spines brushing the glass with a screech. Mrs. Delaney's face went white. "It knows. You've drawn its attention already." Emma's stomach dropped. "You mean, we're already marked?" The old woman nodded grimly. "And once marked, the desert never lets go." Daniel shook his head in disbelief, but Emma could see fear in his eyes now. Their family wasn't just dealing with strange rules or power-hungry neighbors, they were caught in something ancient, something that had swallowed whole towns before them. As the desert wind howled outside, Emma realized they had only two choices: obey the HOA's twisted rules, or risk awakening the sleeper beneath the sand. The desert night was suffocating. A hot wind rattled the windows of the Carter home, carrying with it the dry whisper of shifting dunes. Inside, the family huddled together. Mrs. Delaney sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of her shawl. "It's close," she whispered. "The sleeper is stirring. The rules have been broken too many times." Daniel paced back and forth, frustration burning in his eyes. "This is insane. We're not prisoners. We can fight this, whatever this is. I won't let some cursed sand monster decide how we live." Emma grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Daniel, please. You saw what happened last night. The officers. The neighbors. We can't fight it. Not like this." But Daniel was past listening. Anger was the only shield he had left against the fear clawing at him. He stormed outside before Emma could stop him, the front door slamming behind him. The night fell unnaturally silent. The cicadas stopped. The wind died. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Emma ran to the window and froze. The entire neighborhood was awake, every resident standing in the streets, barefoot, facing east, their bodies swaying in eerie unison. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight. Their mouths opened together, and the chant began again. "Paint before the moon. Align the east. Paint before the moon. Align the east." The ground trembled. Sand spilled from the cracks in the walls, trickling like blood from a wound. Mrs. Delaney rose shakily to her feet. "It's happening. The sleeper is waking." Daniel shouted into the night. "I'm not afraid of you." He raised the wrench high and smashed it against a cactus in the front yard. The blow split it open, spilling thick, black sap onto the sand. The chanting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The desert itself seemed to inhale. And then, with a sound like thunder tearing the sky, the ground split. A massive fissure ripped through the street, swallowing pavement, mailboxes, and yards. The houses shook violently. Emma screamed as the children clung to her. From the chasm rose a deep, guttural moan that rattled their bones. The sand poured upward, not downward, as if gravity had inverted. The sleeper was rising. From beneath the desert emerged something ancient and impossible, a vast shape pushing upward, its surface cracked like dried earth, glowing faintly with the light of buried embers. Massive spines jutted from its back, each one tipped with glowing cactus blooms. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a shifting mass of sand and stone, with hollow pits for eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The neighbors dropped to their knees, bowing in perfect synchrony. The officers in black appeared at the edges of the crowd, their forms flickering like mirages, their voices booming as one. "Noncompliance has awakened the sleeper. The town will be reclaimed." Emma grabbed Lily and Ben, pulling them close. "We have to run." Mrs. Delaney shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "There's nowhere to go. Once it wakes, the desert reshapes itself. Roads vanish. Time bends. We are trapped." Daniel stood defiant, though his face was pale with terror. "If it wants me, it can take me. But I won't bow." The sleeper's gaze turned toward him. The sand beneath his feet writhed like living snakes, coiling around his legs. Daniel swung his wrench desperately, but it sank into the sand as though into water. With a sudden jerk, the desert yanked him down. His scream echoed into the night, then was swallowed whole. "Daniel!" Emma cried, but he was gone. The sand closed over him as if he had never existed. The sleeper's moan deepened, shaking the very air. The houses cracked and crumbled, their walls splitting apart. One by one, the neighbors' bodies stiffened, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide as streams of sand poured out. They collapsed into heaps, empty shells. Emma clutched her children, sobbing. Mrs. Delaney staggered forward, her eyes blazing with desperate resolve. "The only way to stop it is obedience. Do as it asks. Align, paint, anything, now." But it was too late. The sleeper had tasted rebellion. The ground convulsed violently. The Carters' home collapsed behind them in a cloud of dust. Emma shielded Lily and Ben as the sand surged higher, swallowing the streets, the houses, the people. The desert was reclaiming everything. Mrs. Delaney's final words were nearly drowned by the roar of shifting earth. "Run, before it takes you too." And then she, too, was consumed, her voice cut short. Emma ran blindly, clutching her children, stumbling across dunes that hadn't been there minutes before. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Behind them, the sleeper's colossal form loomed, glowing eyes fixed on its prey. The HOA's rules hadn't been madness. They had been chains, fragile but necessary, holding a godlike horror in slumber. And now, those chains were broken. As the moonlight bathed the dunes, Emma whispered a prayer into the empty night, knowing the desert didn't listen. The sleeper was awake. And Sunspire was no more. The desert was silent again. Emma staggered across the endless dunes, her arms aching from carrying Lily while Ben clung to her side. The moon had begun to fade, replaced by the gray light of dawn, but the sun offered no comfort. Behind them, the place where Sunspire had once stood was nothing but flat, rippling sand. No homes. No neighbors. No Daniel. Her breath hitched, and she nearly collapsed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face as the sand swallowed him. His defiance had been brave, maybe even necessary, but it had cost him everything. "Mommy, I'm thirsty," Ben whispered, his voice cracked. Emma kissed the top of his head, forcing strength into her tone. "I know, sweetheart. We'll find water soon." But in truth, she had no idea where they were. The desert stretched on endlessly, identical in every direction. She thought of Mrs. Delaney's words, "Roads vanish, time bends," and wondered if they were even in the same world anymore. Hours passed. The children grew weaker. Emma stumbled but forced herself onward, whispering prayers under her breath. At last, a shimmer appeared on the horizon. At first she thought it was a mirage, but as they drew closer, her heart skipped. A town. Low rooftops. Palm trees. The faint outline of power lines. Relief flooded her body. She quickened her pace, nearly crying with joy. But as the shapes grew clearer, her stomach turned cold. The town looked exactly like Sunspire. The same streets. The same stucco houses. Even the same rusted playground at the edge of the neighborhood. It was Sunspire reborn, as if the desert had rebuilt it from memory. Emma stopped at the edge of the street, trembling. No. No, this isn't real. It can't be. The houses were pristine, freshly painted in desert tones. The cacti stood tall, every one perfectly aligned eastward. The place looked normal. Too normal. A man in a black HOA uniform stepped out from one of the homes. He looked crisp, professional, clipboard in hand. He spotted Emma and the children and smiled politely. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm, warm. "You must be our new residents. Don't worry, we'll get you settled in right away." Emma's throat tightened. "New residents?" The man nodded. "Yes. Sunspire always welcomes those who survive the crossing. The HOA will ensure you and your children are taken care of. All we ask is simple compliance with the rules." Emma's heart pounded. "What if we don't comply?" The man's smile didn't falter. "Then the desert will." Behind him, more officers appeared, identical uniforms, identical smiles. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, waving cheerfully as if nothing had ever happened. Children played in the street. A woman tended her garden, humming softly. It was perfect. Too perfect. Lily buried her face in Emma's neck. "Mommy, I don't like it here." Emma clutched her children tight. She thought of Daniel, of Mrs. Delaney, of the chanting voices. This wasn't a second chance. It was a trap. The sleeper hadn't destroyed them. It had reset the board. The officer gestured down the street. Come. There's a vacant house waiting for you. Number 14. Freshly painted. Facing east, of course. Emma's legs shook. She wanted to run, to fight, but where could she go? The desert offered no escape. The only path was forward. As she stepped into the new Sunspire, she glanced back one last time. The dunes behind her were shifting, the horizon swallowing itself. The world outside the town was dissolving into nothing. They weren't in the real world anymore. They were inside the sleeper's dream. The officer's voice echoed, warm but firm. Welcome to Sunspire. And remember, never question the rules. Emma's scream tore silently into the air, unheard beneath the desert's eternal whisper.